The London season of 1815 moved beneath a veneer of polished civility, yet every church pew and ballroom hummed with cruel calculations. In this world, marriage was rarely a matter of hearts, but a transaction of lineages. Amid this landscape of velvet restraint, Barnaby St. John, the Duke of Kessel, stood at the altar as a figure carved from stone. Though youthful, heavy burdens had etched deep lines into his face, and his dark sideburns framed a jaw set in grim determination. He did not look like a groom awaiting a bride. He looked like a condemned man awaiting the executioner's command. Walking toward him was the wrong woman. It should have been Lydia, the raven-haired firebrand who had been buried only a month prior. Instead, the aisle carried Clemency Fairweather, draped in a gown of pale blue, a hue too light for mourning yet too subdued for celebration. She moved with the quiet resignation of a peace offering. She was the spare, the consolation prize sent to preserve a contract and a fortune. As Clemency reached the altar, the silence was deafening. Barnaby took her hand, his palm startlingly hot against her cold skin. He laced his fingers through hers, not with tenderness, but with a desperate intensity that bordered on pain. His eyes, dark and unreadable, seemed to look right through her, fixed on some ghost visible only to him. The congregation's murmur reached her ears like the buzzing of angry bees. A poor shadow of her sister, a matron whispered behind her fan. "Look at him! He can barely stomach the sight of her," another replied. Yet, as the priest demanded their vows, Barnaby's grip tightened, crushing her fingers as if he were holding on to a cliff's edge. They were married not by love, but by a sentence passed down by the dead. Hang on, dear listener. My granny always says that if I don't get 1,000 subscribers by the next full moon, the algorithm will hide my stories in the attic with the dust bunnies. So, pause for a second. Tell me in the comments which country you are listening from. Smash that like button and subscribe. It helps us share more juicy scandals with you. Granny is watching. The chapel doors closed behind them, sealing their fate. Later, as their carriage rattled over the cobblestones away from the church, a silence stretched between them, vast and cold as an ocean. Clemency stared at her hands, still throbbing from his grip, waiting for him to yell, to weep, to say something. Finally, Barnaby spoke. His voice was low, rough with an emotion she couldn't place. He didn't offer comfort. Instead, he delivered a warning that would haunt her marriage before it had even begun. "Do not try to be her, Clemency," he said, refusing to meet her gaze, staring out the window at the passing gray sky. "I could not bear it if you were anything like her." Clemency felt the blood drain from her face. Was this his grief speaking? Or was it a hatred so deep he couldn't stand the resemblance? She didn't know which answer she feared more. The ducal bedchamber at Kessel Manor was a cavern of shadows and silk, vast enough to swallow a person whole. To Clemency, sitting on the edge of the enormous four-poster bed, it felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, casting a faint, dying glow across the room, yet the air remained biting. She pulled her dressing gown tighter around her shoulders, though she knew the chill shivering through her bones had little to do with the temperature. Barnaby had been pacing for the better part of an hour. The rhythmic thud of his boots against the floorboards was the only sound in the oppressive silence, a metronome counting down to a moment Clemency dreaded. Every time he turned near the fireplace, the flickering light caught the sharp angles of his face. He looked exhausted, his brow furrowed and his mouth drawn in a tight, pained line. He had removed his coat and cravat, leaving his white shirt unbuttoned at the throat, exposing the erratic pulse beating there. He was like a caged animal, restless and agitated. Clemency watched him through lowered lashes, terrified to speak, terrified to move. She felt like an intruder in her own marriage bed, a pale imitation of the vibrant bride who should have been waiting for him. Lydia would have laughed at his pacing. Lydia would have teased him until he smiled. Clemency could only sit in frozen silence, her hands trembling in her lap. Suddenly, Barnaby stopped. He stood at the foot of the bed, gripping one of the heavy mahogany posts until his knuckles turned white. He looked at her then, really looked at her, for the first time since the altar. His dark eyes swept over her lace nightgown, her loosened hair, and her pale, frightened face. Clemency flinched under the intensity of his gaze, bracing herself for cruelty. She expected him to tell her she was inadequate, to ask why fate had taken the diamond and left the stone. Whatever he saw in her seemed to cause him physical pain. A muscle feathered in his jaw, and he squeezed his eyes shut for a fleeting moment, as if trying to banish a vision. When he opened them again, they were swimming with a torment so raw it took her breath away. "I cannot," he rasped, his voice rough and broken. Clemency's heart plummeted. "My lord," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He spun on his heel, turning his back to her, as if the very sight of her was unbearable. Without another word, he strode toward the heavy oak door that connected the bedroom to his private study. He wrenched it open, the hinges groaning in the quiet room. "Sleep, Clemency," he commanded, though the authority in his tone wavered. "I will not disturb you tonight." The door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Clemency stared at the wooden barrier, the rejection settling over her like a heavy shroud. Tears, hot and stinging, finally spilled over her cheeks. She curled onto the cold sheets, weeping for the sister who was gone and the husband who clearly wished she were gone too. But as she drifted into a fitful sleep, her mind replayed the last words he had muttered under his breath. Words too low for her to fully understand, but clear enough to confuse her grief. "I cannot ruin this too." The days following their arrival at Kessel Manor passed in a suffocating haze of polite estrangement. The house was a labyrinth of drafty corridors and closed doors, mirroring the distance Barnaby kept between them. Seeking escape from the silence of her own chambers, Clemency found herself wandering the east wing, drawn toward the long gallery where the eyes of centuries of St. John ancestors watched her with painted indifference. The gallery was bathed in the gray light of a rainy afternoon, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and old varnish. At the far end, a solitary figure stood motionless. Barnaby. He was not looking at the formidable line of dukes that preceded him, but at a fresh addition to the collection, a canvas that still smelled faintly of oil. Clemency froze behind a heavy velvet curtain, her breath catching in her throat. The portrait was massive, dominating the wall with an arrogance that only one woman had ever possessed. Lydia, the artist had captured her sister perfectly. The raven hair piled high, the crimson dress that seemed to burn against the dark background, and that signature smirk that promised mischief and demanded adoration. Even in oil and pigment, Lydia sucked all the air out of the room. Barnaby stood before it, his posture rigid. Clemency watched, her heart aching for him. She expected to see his shoulders shake with suppressed sobs, or perhaps to see him reach out and trace the face of the woman he had intended to marry. She prepared herself to witness the raw grief of a man robbed of his true love. But Barnaby did not weep. As Clemency moved a fraction closer, the floorboard beneath her boot groaning softly, she saw his profile. His jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle jumped beneath the skin, and his eyes blazed not with sorrow, but with a cold, simmering fury. He looked at the painting as if it were an enemy he had finally cornered. Clemency shrank back, confused. He was angry at death, she told herself. He was furious that the universe had snuffed out such a bright light and left him with a shadow. It was a passion she could never hope to incite in him. Barnaby took a step closer to the canvas, his hand raising slowly. For a terrifying second, Clemency thought he might strike the painting. Instead, his hand curled into a fist at his side, the leather of his glove straining across his knuckles. He lowered his head, the fight seemingly draining out of him, leaving only a jagged exhaustion. "Finally free," he whispered into the empty air. The words drifted back to Clemency, faint and chilling. She pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Finally free? Did he mean Lydia was free from the mortal coil? Or did he mean something else entirely? Before she could decipher the unsettling tone of his voice, somewhere between relief and self-loathing, Barnaby turned sharply and strode out the opposite door, leaving Clemency alone with the painted smirk of her dead sister and a question that made her blood run cold. For the first time since the funeral, Clemency chose not to wear the drab grays and blacks that had defined her existence as a mourning sister. Instead, she reached into the back of her wardrobe and pulled out a gown of softest cerulean silk. It was a dress from before the sickness, before the pact, before she became a duchess by default. It was the color of a summer sky, simple and unadorned, the very antithesis of the heavy velvets Lydia had favored. Putting it on felt like a quiet act of rebellion, a desperate attempt to remind herself that she was Clemency, not merely a ghost understudy. Dinner was served in the main hall, a cavernous room where the candlelight struggled to push back the encroaching shadows. Barnaby was already seated at the head of the long mahogany table, nursing a glass of wine. He looked weary, his cravat slightly loosened, his gaze fixed on the empty plate before him. Clemency entered softly, the silk whispering against the floorboards. "Good evening, my lord," she murmured, taking her place at the opposite end of the table. Barnaby looked up, the polite greeting dying on his lips. He froze, his hand, which had been reaching for his fork, arrested in midair. For a long, suffocating moment, he simply stared, his eyes widening as they swept over the pale blue bodice and the delicate lace at her throat. Then the silver fork slipped from his fingers. It clattered against the fine china with a violence that rang through the silent room like a bell toll. The servants froze in the shadows. Clemency's breath hitched, her hands flying to her lap to hide their trembling. She waited for the reprimand, for the cold remark about her lack of propriety in wearing colors so soon, or perhaps a sneer how plain she looked compared to the vibrant memory of his lost love. Barnaby did not apologize for the clumsiness. He did not pick up the utensil. He sat paralyzed, his chest rising and falling with a rhythm that seemed too fast for a man simply eating dinner. His gaze was heavy, physical in its weight. Tracing the line of her collarbone and the slope of her neck where the blue silk met her pale skin. Is the dress to your displeasure, Barnaby?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I can change." He blinked, as if waking from a trance, but the intensity in his dark eyes did not dim. He cleared his throat, the sound rough. "No," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Do not change." He picked up his wine glass instead of his fork, draining it in a single draught, his eyes never leaving her. The rest of the meal passed in a silence thicker than the stone walls around them. He did not pay her a single compliment, nor did he offer a smile. Yet, every time she lifted her gaze, she found him watching her. His eyes lingered on the pulse fluttering at the base of her throat with a dark, starving focus that made her skin prickle. As the footmen cleared the plates, Clemency felt a flush rise from her chest to her cheeks, leaving her dizzy with a question she dared not ask. Was he looking at her with a hatred for her living breath, or a hunger he despised himself for feeling? The ballroom was a suffocating sea of diamonds and judgment. To Clemency, the air felt thin, sucked away by the hundreds of guests who whispered behind fan blades painted with pastoral scenes. She stood near a potted palm, wishing she could dissolve into the damask wallpaper. She had felt the stares all evening, sharp, assessing glances that weighed her against the memory of Lydia, and found her wanting. Lady Augusta, a viper in crimson silk who had once vied for Barnaby's attention, glided over with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Duchess," she purred, the title dripping with irony. "How?" "Practical to families. Though one must wonder how it feels to live in such a large shadow. To know one is merely wearing a dead woman's cast-offs. Even down to the husband. Is he terribly bored with the second-hand goods?" Clemency opened her mouth, humiliated heat flooding her cheeks, but no words came. The cruelty was so precise, so public, that it robbed her breath. "Careful, Augusta." The voice was low, vibrating with a menace that seemed to drop the temperature of the immediate vicinity. Barnaby stepped out of the crowd, placing himself physically between Clemency and her tormentor. He loomed over the other woman, his expression terrifyingly calm, his youthful face hardened into the visage of a ruthless patriarch. "I would suggest you worry less about my marriage and more about your own relevance," Barnaby said, his voice slicing to the chatter like a razor. "One is a matter of my private devotion. The other is rapidly becoming non-existent. Speak of my wife with anything less than reverence again, and you'll find every door in London bolted against you by morning." Lady Augusta turned the color of ash, her fan snapping shut. Barnaby didn't wait for a retort. He gripped Clemency's elbow, his touch iron firm, and steered her swiftly toward the exit, leaving a wake of stunned silence behind them. Listen closely. Barnaby just risked his reputation to save hers. If you don't subscribe right now, you are risking missing the greatest redemption arc of the year. Do you really want to be the person who walked away when things got tough? Don't be a ghost viewer. Subscribe now, or tell me in the comments why you fear commitment. Outside, the carriage awaited in the damp night air. Barnaby all but lifted her inside, barking an order to the driver before slamming the door, plunging them into intimate darkness. The carriage lurched forward, and the tension in the small space was electric. Barnaby was breathing hard, the adrenaline of the confrontation stripping away his usual mask of indifference. "Why?" Clemency whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Why defend me? You don't even want me." He turned to her, his eyes flashing in the passing gaslight. "Because you are—" He cut himself off, leaning in. The air between them crackled. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from him, smell the brandy and starch on his collar. His gaze dropped to her lips, his head tilting, the hunger from the dinner table returning with violent force. Clemency parted her lips, a silent invitation, her soul aching for him to bridge the gap. But just as their breath mingled, Barnaby jerked back, as if he had touched a hot coal. He slammed his back against the squabs, turning his face to the window, his hand clenching into a fist on his knee. "Forgive me," he muttered, his voice thick with self-loathing. "I almost forgot myself." Clemency sat frozen, the rejection stinging worse than the insult in the ballroom. He was fighting a war inside himself. But why? Was it loyalty to Lydia that stopped him, or was the idea of kissing her truly so repulsive that he had to physically recoil? The silence in the carriage had convinced Clemency of a terrible truth. Barnaby did not want a wife. He wanted a memory. The way he had pulled back from her lips, as if touching her were a betrayal, gnawed at her resolve until desperation took root. If he could not love Clemency, perhaps he could tolerate a reflection of the woman he mourned. Sitting before her vanity, Clemency instructed her maid to abandon the simple, demure plaits she usually wore. "Higher," Clemency commanded, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Pile it high, with loose curls at the nape, like my sister used to wear." The maid hesitated, meeting Clemency's gaze in the glass with worry, but she obeyed. It took nearly an hour of pinning and twisting, teasing the volume until Clemency's silhouette transformed. Though her hair was a shade lighter than Lydia's raven tresses, the effect in the dim candlelight was striking. She turned her head, and for a fleeting second, she saw the ghost of her sister staring back, imperious, bold, and undeniably beautiful. It was a mask, but a mask she hoped would finally unlock her husband's heart. The door to her chamber opened without a knock. Barnaby stood on the threshold, perhaps coming off of the apology he had failed to voice the night before. "Clemency, regarding the—" He stopped dead. The words evaporated from the air. Clemency stood slowly, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She turned to face him, offering a tentative, hopeful smile, waiting for his eyes to soften, for him to see the effort she had made to bridge the chasm between them. But Barnaby did not soften. The blood drained from his face so rapidly it left him gray, his skin taking on the pallor of a corpse. He staggered back a step, his hand blindly gripping the doorframe for support, his eyes wide and fixed on her hair. He didn't look like a man seeing his beloved return to him. He looked like a man trapped in a waking nightmare. "Take it down," he whispered, the sound strangled. Clemency blinked, confusion washing over her. "My lord? I only thought—" "I said, take it down," he roared, the sudden violence of his voice making her jump. He crossed the room in 2 strides, not to embrace her, but to loom over her with frantic, terrifying energy. He reached out, his hands hovering near the pins, as if he wanted to rip them out himself, but couldn't bear to touch the illusion. "Take it down immediately. Do not ever wear your hair like that again. Do you hear me? Never." He was breathing in ragged gasps, his chest heaving. Clemency frantically began pulling the pins free, her fingers clumsy with shock, letting the curls tumble down in a disheveled mess. As the style collapsed, Barnaby slumped against a vanity table, passing a hand over his face. He looked sick, nauseous with terror. It wasn't the anger of a grieving lover insulted by a poor imitation. It was a visceral fear of a man haunted by something far darker than loss. As Clemency wept silently, pulling the last pin free, she realized with a chill that the specific arrangement of curls hadn't reminded him of love. It had reminded him of something he was desperate to forget. The storm that had been threatening to break over Kessel Manor finally arrived, lashing against the stone walls with fury that matched the chaos inside the master suite. Barnaby had collapsed in the library only hours after the incident with the hairpins, his body surrendering to a fever that burned with frightening intensity. The physician had come and gone, muttering about brain fever and nervous exhaustion, leaving behind a row of bitter tonics and a household holding its breath. Clemency took her place at his bedside, dismissing the fretful valet with a quiet authority she hadn't known she possessed. This was her domain. She was a fair-weather sister, the calm in the center of the gale. While Lydia had been the lightning, Clemency was the steady rain that followed, cooling the earth. She dipped a linen cloth into a basin of lavender water, wringing it out with steady hands before placing it gently against Barnaby's burning forehead. He looked younger in his delirium, the harsh lines of duty smoothed away by the heat flushing his skin. But he was not at peace. He tossed on the damp sheets, his head turning restlessly from side to side, trapped in a labyrinth of his own mind. "No!" he moaned, the word tearing from his throat. "Cannot tell her." Clemency leaned closer, her heart aching. She braced herself for the name she knew was coming. She prepared herself to hear him cry out for Lydia, to beg the ghost to return to him. It was a torture she felt she deserved for trying to impersonate the dead. "I am here, Barnaby," she whispered, smoothing the damp hair back from his temple. "Rest now." He gasped, his eyes flying open. They were glassy and unfocused, swimming with shadows only he could see. He stared up at the canopy, then his gaze dragged downward, locking onto Clemency's face. For a moment, she wasn't sure if he saw her or a hallucination born of the fever. Suddenly, his hand shot out, gripping her wrist with strength that made her wince. He pulled her closer, his touch searing against her skin. "You!" he rasped, his voice thick with emotion. "It was always you." Clemency froze, her breath catching in her throat. The world seemed to stop. The rain outside, the crackle of the fire, the pounding of her own heart, all fell silent. Barnaby's grip slackened, his eyelids fluttering closed as the exhaustion claimed him once more. He sank back into the pillows, his breathing deepening into a heavy, rhythmic slumber, leaving Clemency paralyzed by the bedside. She stared at his sleeping face, her mind reeling. It was always you. The words hung in the air, fragile and confusing. Did he mean her, Clemency, the woman holding his hand? Or in the haze of his fever, had he looked at her and seen Lydia? Had he confessed his eternal love to the sister he thought was sitting there? Or had he, for one delirious moment, recognized the wife who had been waiting in the shadows all along? With Barnaby's fever finally breaking, the household exhaled a collective sigh of relief, settling into a quiet rhythm of recovery. While the Duke slept the heavy, restorative sleep of the convalescent, Clemency took it upon herself to manage the correspondence that had piled up during his illness. She entered his private study with a sense of trepidation, the room usually forbidden to her, smelling of tobacco, old leather, and a specific, woodsy cologne. She sat at the massive oak desk, feeling small in his imposing chair, while searching for a fresh pot of ink to draft a note to his solicitors. Her fingers brushed against a hidden catch inside the central drawer. It clicked softly, revealing a false bottom, a secret compartment designed to hold a man's most private treasures. Clemency's heart skipped a beat. She knew she should close it immediately. A wife had no right to pry into her husband's hidden grief. Surely, this was where he kept the tokens of his lost love. A lock of hair, a dried flower, or perhaps a miniature portrait of Lydia. But curiosity, sharp and insistent, stayed her hand. She reached in and pulled out a thick bundle of letters tied with a black ribbon. She recognized the handwriting instantly. It was Lydia's, bold, sprawling, and chaotic. The ink pressed hard into the parchment. These were the letters her sister had sent her in their long engagement. Missives that Clemency imagined were filled with passion, wit, and the fiery declarations Lydia was famous for. Clemency felt a pang of jealousy, so acute it nearly doubled her over. These were the words he must have clung to during those long nights of pacing. But as she turned the stack over in her hands, the jealousy vanished, replaced by a cold shock. The wax seals were unbroken. Every single letter bore the crest of their father's house, pressed into crimson wax, and not one of them had a crack or a smudge. They were pristine. The edges of the paper were crisp, untouched by human hands. Barnaby had received them, categorized them, and locked them away in the dark without ever reading a single word his betrothed had written. Clemency stared at the bundle, her breath coming in shallow gasps. If he had loved Lydia as the world believed, if he was truly the grieving fiancé haunted by a tragic loss, these letters would be worn soft from reading. They would be tear-stained and cherished. Instead, they were treated like evidence of a crime, hidden and ignored. She placed the bundle back on the desk, her hands trembling. The revelation upended everything she thought she knew about her marriage. If he hadn't cared enough to read Lydia's letters, then his coldness, his anger, and his distance were not born of grief. But if he didn't mourn Lydia, why was he so tormented by his marriage to Clemency? Why look at her with such anguish if he was free of the sister's ghost? The mystery of Barnaby's St. John did not unravel. It only tightened, choking the air from the room. The door creaked open, and Barnaby entered the study, looking pale but steady on his feet for the first time in days. He stopped abruptly when he saw Clemency standing behind his desk, the bundle of unopened letters resting on the blotter, between them like an accusation. His eyes flickered from her face to the black ribbon, and his expression hardened into that familiar, impenetrable mask. "Clemency," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You should not be in here. And you should have had the decency to read them." Clemency shot back, her voice shaking with a rage she hadn't known she possessed. She picked up the bundle and threw it down again, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "She loved you, Barnaby. She wrote to you every week. And you? You didn't even break the seals. Are you truly so heartless? Or was she just a trophy you couldn't be bothered to polish?" Barnaby flinched as if she had struck him. "You do not know what you speak of. I know that I am married to a man who treats women like furniture." Clemency cried, stepping around the desk to face him, her fair-weather calm finally shattering into a storm. "You mourn a woman you didn't even respect enough to listen to, and now you punish me for not being her, while you treated her like—" "I never punished you for not being her," Barnaby roared. The sound was so loud it rattled the window panes. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, backing her against the heavy bookshelves. He wasn't the composed Duke anymore. He was a man unraveled, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with desperation that had been festering for years. He slammed his hands against the shelves on either side of her head, trapping her. "You think I am heartless?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "You think I didn't read them because I didn't care? I didn't read them because every word she wrote was a reminder of the lie I was living. I couldn't bear to read her talk of a future I never wanted." Clemency stared up at him, breathless and terrified. "What?" "My heart was never hers, Clemency." The confession tore out of him, raw and bleeding. I never looked at Lydia. Not once. Not truly. From the moment I walked into your father's drawing room 3 years ago, I saw only you. But you were the younger sister, the quiet one, the one hidden in the corner while she dazzled the room. I courted her because it was the only excuse I had to be in the same room as you. I agreed to marry her just to stay near the sister who stood in the shadows. The silence that followed was absolute. The confession hung between them, impossible and overwhelming. Clemency felt the world tilt on its axis. All the coldness, the avoidance, the anger. It hadn't been grief for Lydia. It had been guilt. Guilt for loving the wrong sister. Barnaby leaned his forehead against hers, his fight draining away, leaving him trembling. It was never her, he whispered, his voice broken. It was always you. Clemency stood frozen in the circle of his arms, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. The truth was out, naked and shivering in the space between them. But after months of icy rejection and cryptic warnings, could she trust the warmth of his words? Or was this just another fevered dream born of a man desperate to absolve himself of his sins? The confession stripped the last of Barnaby's defenses away, leaving him exposed and breathless. He slumped slightly against the bookshelf, his eyes searching hers for condemnation. Instead, he found only a dawning, fragile hope. I treated you with silence because I did not know how to speak without confessing my own treachery, he admitted, his voice rough. When Lydia passed, I felt a relief that sickened me. I thought myself a monster. And then, when our families invoked a contract, when I saw you walking down that aisle, I was terrified. I thought if I let myself love you, I would consume you. I tried to freeze you out to save you from a husband whose soul was already stained by deceit. Clemency reached out, her fingers brushing the tears that had gathered on his lashes. You were never a monster, Barnaby, she whispered. You were just a man carrying a burden too heavy for one heart. He caught her hand, turning it palm up in his own. He stared at her open palm for a moment, as if reading his future in the lines there, before interlacing his fingers with hers. The grip was firm, desperate, and intimate, a silent vow that he would never let go again. I don't want a ghost, he murmured, leaning down until his forehead rested against hers. I want the sun. I want the fair weather. When he kissed her, it was not the tentative, frightened act of the carriage ride. It was a claiming. It was an apology and a promise fused into one. The storm that had raged through Kessel Manor for months finally broke, the clouds dissolving to reveal a sky of limitless blue. They finally found their happiness. But will you find yours? If you leave this video without subscribing, you are choosing to walk alone in the dark. Don't let the algorithm divorce us. Subscribe now to lock in your happy ending. Those who don't, well, check the comments and weep with the others who missed out. The seasons turned, and the chill of that wretched winter was soon forgotten. Kessel Manor, once a tomb of silence, filled with light and laughter. Barnaby no longer paced the floors at night. He found his rest in the warmth of the marriage bed, holding his wife as if she were the most precious thing in England. And when spring finally arrived, bringing with it the scent of blooming hyacinths, it brought another gift as well. One morning, Clemency found Barnaby in the nursery, a room that had been closed for years. He was standing by the window, smiling as he watched the dust motes dance in the sunlight, his hand resting absently on an empty wooden cradle. He didn't need to ask. The glow on her face told him everything. The shadows were gone and a new life was beginning.